this afternoon's webinar for the EU-InnovatE project. I'm the Director of International Programs at in Brussels. It's just a little placeholder to say that we're going to wait another couple of minutes for little people to log on to the web platform, and we will get everything going at 3:05 on the dot. So please bear with us for another couple of minutes, and don't if you fail to hear anybody speaking in the next 2 minutes. So good afternoon once again to those who've been on for a few minutes, and welcome to our newcomers to the 6th and final international webinar for the EU-InnovatE project, Sustainable Lifestyles and Green Economy in Europe to 2050. So first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to join us this afternoon amid what is inevitably a very busy schedule. I'm very excited about the topic of today's presentation with our colleagues from Forum from the Future in the UK, because it is in many ways at the heart of the ambitions and the aspirations of our project. We're going to be listening to some new insights about scenarios for sustainable lifestyles in 2050 and assessing short and long-term opportunities and obstacles through which we might achieve those. So, Marco, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Here's how the webinar will run this afternoon. A very quick introduction and background context from myself, and then over to Gemma Adams and Liz Armstrong in London for the emerging findings from Forum's work around the future scenarios. The presentation will run through until about 3:35, 3:40, then we'll have time available for questions and comments. I should note at this point that you have a couple of options for doing so. You can text in the chat box if you have any remarks or observations during the presentation, and then at the end of the presentation we'll open up everybody's microphones, hopefully without too much background noise, and you can simply activate your microphone and share any questions with Gemma and Louise. And if there are any slightly uncomfortable silences, I will do my best to fill them. We'll wrap up with a couple of comments about the forthcoming final conference and bring proceedings to a close around 4 o'clock. So, a couple of words on the background to this very ambitious project that we've been working on for the last 3 years. Sustainable lifestyles really started to come into European policy thinking 2010, 2011, with the headline objectives to understand how sustainable living could also promote more sustainable, smart and inclusive growth in the single market and its links to jobs, competitiveness, and the overall European economy. And the second is a wider concern about how Europe manages an aging population while reducing, an aging and growing population, I should say, while reducing current levels of energy transport and use of natural resources. Perhaps most importantly, it's how we get our heads around new consumption and production systems to support a transition to a low-carbon or sustainable economy by 2050. The project itself is supported by some scenarios that were developed in 2011 and 2012 through the Spread 2050 social platform. I dwell on those here. This will also come through in some of Louise and Gemma's remarks. I have a web link to sustainable-lifestyle.eu. I do encourage you to go and have a look at the reports and the materials available to understand how Europe thinks about sustainable lifestyle scenarios for the next 20, 30 years. Next slide. So building on Spread 2050, the European Commission invited proposals that would look at a number of very important research questions for them. All to understand the links between different systems in Europe, from through to technological, and these were shaping consumer values and behaviour. Was to look at the long-term and obstacles and opportunities that assist to transitions to sustainable living and green economy would, and that's very much around the scenarios work that Forum have been doing in the last 3 years. This was about the new business models and perhaps enterprise forms that would achieve this balance of natural resource management and improving consumption and quality of life at a European level. Last but not least, there was a call for better data to understand the actual impact of different emissions within the domains of food, energy, living, and mobility. Narrate us on the 2050. Next slide, please. This is the group that we brought together in late 2012 to respond to this opportunity from the European Commission. We're coordinated as a group by the Technische Universität in München, School of Management, and Professor Frank Martin Beltz. And as you can see, it's a pan-European group of leading business schools, universities, and platforms like Forum and ABIS, who get a bridge between those business, academic, and policy realms to make sense of what's coming out of the world of science. This is at the heart of our investigation, our project. We felt that there was an emerging phenomenon that could be explored, which is the creative, innovative, and entrepreneurial roles of users and citizens in developing new sustainable products, services, and systems, which taken together could add up to something that resembled sustainable lifestyles 2.0, as we generically call it. Next slide, please. This is a simple representation of the space that we've been trying to analyze. So from where you see the star in the bottom left quadrant of a classic consumerism model of pretty passive users and consumers and a very fragmented community of individuals. So the right quadrant, where employ new technologies, social media, open access to data, and the like, the communities of innovation beginning to emerge, both around large companies and established innovation platforms, but also between users and citizens and at the community level. So the phenomenon that we've been trying to unpick is how to understand the way in which collective users become producing users and create new companies as a result, and what are key drivers and success factors for that to happen. Okay. This is a visualization of sustainable lifestyles and the rise of the citizen as innovator. It's a beautiful graphic created by Forum on the back of one of their workshops a few years ago. Now, Louise and Gemma, I should just quickly check, is this where you would like me to hand it to you or carry on for another slide or two? Excuse me, I've forgotten exactly where the transition point is. Very good. So with that, I'm going to transfer over to Louise and Gemma in London. The talk is yours, and we look forward very much to hearing your insights.
Thanks, Simon. So, as you mentioned, this book is taken from one of the workshops that we did as part of EU-InnovatE. It's one of a whole host of resources that have been developed over the course of the project that we'll now want to make available to others. So what I'm going to do now is give you a very brief shot. It's more of a glimpse of the 3 years of work that we've done and give you an idea of the sorts of resources that we have so that we can connect with you, we can talk about how you might be able to use them and through the implications for you in your organisation or your own pursuits. And the first point to make is we've been looking at the future trajectory for users and communities and citizens innovating. And a theme we're going to explore through my presentation is that the concept of a user, someone that buys a product and adapts that product for their purpose, radically expand in the future, because digital technologies, access to data, the ability for us to collaborate and create prototypes and scale up innovations that we create just explodes into the future. So the scope of what's possible for normal people to happen commercially, both in relation to what they consume, also outside of that in other areas of their life, also explodes. This is an area for which there is academic language, an area for which we're exploring labels and how we can communicate this to people that are out in the world and doing all of this stuff, and so that we can be explicit about what's happening, and we can start to work with that and explore the opportunities for harnessing it to create change for sustainability. Next slide, please. So I'm going to cover now is a quick overview of the techniques that we used, and in particular 4 visions that we adapted from a piece of work called Spread 2050 Sustainable Lifestyles, which were 4 visions of how Europe could achieve a variety of environmental and social sustainability targets in 2050. And we're going to cover some of the key insights that we derived from the process of developing those scenarios and then analysing them. And as I mentioned, we'll be looking at the scope and speed at which people can innovate, the fact that that's increasing, and the many opportunities then that opens up for users to play a role in change. I'm going to talk about what the implications are for us if we want to dematerialise, to create sort of radical change towards sustainable lifestyles going forwards, and also that in the same that people that are advocating for sustainability and innovating for sustainability, in the same way that they're being equipped to create change, so everyone's being equipped, and so the resistance to that path is also increasing. So we'll look at what that means for the strategies that we might deploy and for creating change. And we're going to briefly touch on the question raised by that we'd really love to explore with people to take forward into our various work, and we'll recap the different resources that are now available for you to use. Next. Sort of these 3 areas, so we're going to touch on the futures methods and resources. We're going to take a look back in time, first of all, just to look historically at what users have innovated and what they've done. Some of the signs that we're all probably seeing today of citizens and users being equipped and innovating differently now. Give you an idea of what we're seeing emerging in terms of future trends, how it starts to play out in one of the 4 scenarios that I mentioned earlier on, and then look at the implications of that for us. First then, scenarios that we have adapted through this project are pretty unique in the sense that they start with the question, what would it take, what would need to be consistent in society in order for the material footprint of the average person in Europe to be about a quarter of what it is today. At the same time, so as well as achieving that radical dematerialisation, what would it take for us to also be upholding key environmental boundaries? So, for example, to maintaining global warming at no more than 2 degrees, to have stabilised biodiversity loss, and to have dealt with freshwater use and pollution and a whole ocean acidification. So what would need to be true in the world for all of those things to be met, at the same time as improving upon levels of inequality, improving on basic life expectancy, levels of education and so on in the world. So it starts with the question of what to really achieve, not just a couple of these different targets, but a whole range of targets. And of course that then takes us into very systemic questions of what infrastructures need to exist, what patterns of consumption need to exist, what culture we need to be living in, how many of us there will be in the world, how we will be living. So you end with these very sort of integrated and very sort of large societal questions in order to meaningfully and plausibly arrive at a set of scenarios that can achieve all of these things. Start with an understanding of where we're now in 2016 as being oriented towards economic growth very strongly. That being seen as a key leverage for improving all lives and for developing the world and our society. So there's a strong emphasis on growth that we have now. The fact that our identity and our economies are structured in nation states, and that we have quite an unsystemic approach generally to production and to policy creation. We tend today to be quite linear and quite mechanistic about how we approach our lives, how we understand cause and effect. And all of things are challenged when fast forward to 2050 in the scenario. And that's their strength. It allows us to explore things that are quite alien to us today, but are consistent with all the different social conditions and environmental boundaries being met. So next, please. Here's the detail of scenarios. We'd like to share them with you after this presentation. There's a lot of information there, so I just want to give you an overview now. So summary, explore different cultural mindsets and ways of living, fundamentally. And you can see that they're structured along a vertical axis of, to an extent, the ways in which we live is very outwardly looking to the world, and we see our identity and we connect with people on a very global level, versus being very sort of locally oriented, which could be on a city level, it could be a neighbourhood scale, it could still be nation state level. And then on the horizontal axis, according to the extent to which institutions of government are imposing policy frameworks and regulatory forms that then manage to regulate our world, our economy, to hit all of those different boundaries and conditions, versus systems of governance that are much more grassroots and more bottom up, and that evolved in some cases because institutions of government have failed along the pathway to 2050. So they've arisen as a way of compensating for a lack of action, and citizens and combinations of citizens and organisations find workarounds and finding evolved ways of doing things in order to deal with the symptoms of unsustainability along the pathway. And for each of the scenarios, we have a very sort of comprehensive description of what's going on in that society. So a description of the economy, the state of environment, what it means to be a citizen in that world, and there's a different mindset, a different outlook, and a different way of relating to one another in each of these worlds. What we understand by wealth, obviously today it's very financially centred. In these worlds, we see value in non-material things much more, and what it means to be healthy. We have measures around life expectancy in these worlds, particularly in empathetic communities. It's actually the quality of your life rather than the length of your life that people really value and equate with living healthily. So you could probably get a sense of the extent to which some of the fundamental assumptions that we have today about how development happens and what's desirable are really, really challenged in these worlds. And that's what's unique about them and what's really interesting and useful about them. Next slide, please. And work them on our own, working with a network of individuals who are a real mix of entrepreneurs, people starting community initiatives, people really interested in innovation in policy, so a whole variety of interests. What you see them is that they're interested in sustainability and they're interested in radical change and radical forms of innovation to get there. So over the course of the 3 years that Simon mentioned, with a series of workshops, both to develop these scenarios and then to interrogate them and to test some of the implications of them. Next one, please. And on the way out to 2050, and for what we do now, is valuable as looking at what's changed and how these worlds are different, how these sustainable societies are different from our unsustainable world now. So we've spent quite a bit of time, and there's a real richness of insight and resources that we have in exploring exactly how the transition happens and what is that comes together to generate profound cultural shifts and shift in the of investment in infrastructure and so on that can result in resource consumption hitting the incredible lows that it does in each of these worlds. So the path is fascinating, and we have explored what we can learn from those routes to change to do now. Next one. With of course, in our exam question, which is the role of users. And in EU-InnovatE at large, there have been pieces of work done which are all available on the website, looking at historical examples of user innovation and what we can learn from those patterns, what we can see happening today. The piece I'm talking to you about now and the forum has been most closely involved with is how we see that playing forward into the future. This is a new phenomenon. People always created stuff and found workarounds and collaborated in different ways with each other and with businesses to meet their needs. What's fascinating about this from a sustainability point of view and from a lifestyle point of view is more people are more easily equipped to do this stuff, and once they've done it, to be able to share it with people all around the world and to create scale through it. But that's what we've been exploring through the futures pieces, how these things play out and what would be the implications. Next, please.
This is where we're going to go slightly back in time to just think about how were users and people innovating before, just so you can get a flavour of how different the type of innovation we're seeing through the scenarios is. So if you look at innovation in the past, often it's users incidentally innovating products, and it is largely product focused. So, in the early cars is actually tinkering with the cars to modify them for their own needs. The mountain bike emerged because, again, people who wanted to take them off-road and into more extreme terrains, and actually they started to create mountain bikes off the top of that. And you have, traditionally companies are closed and innovating in the past. An example of the Xbox is they released this out into the world. The different games actually started to create modifications, but Microsoft really rejected that until they realized, and it took quite a long time, that these modifications could improve the product, it could improve the gaming service, and now it's an open system. So it shows that almost the role of users was quite strained largely to products in the past, and what we're seeing now is this is starting to shift. So if we go to the next slide, what we're going to see, and I'm sure many of you are aware of all of these different things, is dedicated spaces and subcultures of innovation starting to emerge. From your fab labs and your hacker spaces to your make spaces and code working spaces. These are kind of spaces where people aren't just tinkering with existing products, but people are instigating and making and designing new products, new services, and a kind of new culture and ethos that comes around all of these things. And this proliferate all over the place, and don't see this kind of culture really stopping. Go to the next slide. What we're seeing is that organizations are realizing that this kind of culture of innovation and entrepreneurship is also challenging how they're working with their customers and how they're working with communities. So a number of different examples where organizations are actually enabling people to innovate through the Marks and Sparks program, which is about providing tools and training to community groups to actually develop new solutions that matter for community groups. You have the O'Clock example, which is Skanska and IKEA working with communities to co-design new forms of living. So there's a generative conversation happening between these different organisations, so they're each supporting each other. It's no longer users or customers being left just to innovate on the side. Actually, it's being invited in by different organisations. Then if you is when city seeing it is actually going well beyond the realm of products and services. Actually, we're seeing a huge amount of innovation happening in the kind of governance space that hasn't happened before. And at this point, we actually start to see things will fundamentally shift the structures that we're all operating within. And a whole plethora of examples where Mexico City is crowdsourcing its constitution. Iceland have done something similar. You've had Dutch citizens taking the government to court over inaction on climate change and winning. So it's really citizens bringing governments to account. There's a new platform that's been released recently, 2050 Belgium, which is a tool to allow citizens in Belgium to actually design what a low carbon society could look like. And then there's in London, where the Mayor of London is actually providing money to community groups to run and develop projects in their local areas. So you see kind of the balance of power is shifting, and the spaces of innovation, or where innovation is being applied by people, is actually changing really fundamentally beyond kind of what we traditionally knew as innovation or thought of as innovation. This is the next slide. And this is a scenario to help us tell stories of where else we think this innovation, where users and citizens and communities can actually start to in all sorts of different aspects of people's lives. You see people innovating everywhere, and we start to see seeds of this today. So there's a group in Birmingham that are looking at radical childcare means, something that hasn't been innovated for a long time, but what are the new models for how we might care for people. Then you have your embassy networks that's looking at co-living spaces all over the world. How can you sign up to the network and go and live in San Francisco, but also then go and live in Shanghai? So there's all sorts of interesting new models that are being created for how people live and work and be. And all of these things have started to be innovated by people as well. So these are just a kind of few examples that start to make the future scenarios that we've developed look a bit more plausible, because actually they're starting to happen already. Slide, please. So what are we seeing in the scenarios then? And in a nutshell, we're seeing users and citizens and communities innovating just about everything you can think of. And I'm going to come on to why that's interesting in just a moment. But just to give a flavour of, when we sort of curtain and we glimpse at one of these 2050 worlds, the sorts of things we've been finding. Introduce you to Clara and Sebastian. So these are two fictional characters that were generated through one of the workshops that we ran a year or so ago in Berlin with a number of our Future Shapers network. And we were exploring particular points of significant change on the pathway to the governing the commons scenario. We were asking ourselves, what was it that occurred at that particular point that led to a significant shift happening? Like what happened in the lead up to it, and then what was it that reoccurred that led to a new policy being instigated, or something becoming mainstream or acceptable, whereas previously it wasn't, and there was a knock-on effect from that point into the scenario trajectory. So Clara is a trust architect, working a very distributed value network in the fashion industry. She's an entrepreneur on one hand. She also knows that she will develop a serious health condition later in her life, thanks to genetic profiling. So using those professional skills that she used in her work, she galvanised people that share the same genetic anomaly that she has to work together so that they can plug some of the research gaps that exist in understanding the disease and treating the disease. And the plan is that she will co-design with them care services that they need using virtual networks and citizen science platforms and crowdfunding platforms and that. And so you can see this example that she's not really acting in a user capacity. She is in some ways, but she's almost bringing all of this all together in the different spheres of her life to deal with a particular challenge that she has around her health.
Sebastian is also dealing with a particular issue. It's more around his business though, rather than his person. So struggling at this point in the pathway. Business and commerce, as we know, is being significantly disrupted by digital fabrication. He's in that space, but it's struggling because government regulation is not keeping pace with the speed of technological development, which means there's a lot of intellectual property theft, privacy issues are getting in the way of him growing his business. Government funds are being really pulled back at this point in the pathway, and so Sebastian is looking at this situation and asking what other channels he can use besides traditional lobbying as a way of tackling this. So what he's doing is he's teaming up with other businesses around the world, now developing what they're calling a digital self-surveillance system, which is basically a complicated piece of software and set of algorithms that detect and track and reclaim lost income as a result of theft that's happening through digital channels. And this innovation, the reason I'm sharing it is it's not something that you would necessarily think of as being a contributor towards sustainability or to sustainable lifestyle. What's interesting is, at a later point, once this self-surveillance software is up and running to tackle this particular challenge, a group of users come together, again, globally, to harness that same technology as a way of tracking and measuring carbon emissions around the world. So it becomes a key instrument, ultimately, in the global response to climate change in this scenario, which happens quite late, which hence the reason that citizens and communities want to act on it, because they're feeling the effects of climate change. It's becoming a health issue, and governments globally just aren't acting in a commensurate way. So they seize upon this technology, and through a variety of other elements coming together, it becomes a core part of the response to climate change. So from these examples, you get a sense of those ways in which people are innovating, and also the fact that the contributions being made towards sustainability and sustainable lifestyles aren't necessarily the traditional ones that we would think. So they're really contributors to improving recycling rates, or to products to be disassembled and remanufactured in a circular fashion. They are aspects of lifestyles, all of which need to work together for sustainability to happen. All these things need to be nested and need to be coherent and need to be dissolved in order to happen. But they're also dealing, particularly in the case of Sebastian, with some of the contextual points that are needed in order for individuals to be able to play their part in sustainability. So dealing with the way in which carbon emissions are tracked and so on is actually pretty fundamental to the societal shift that needs to take place. And I think that enables individuals, even if it's not something that you would necessarily think about on a day-to-day basis in your household. So they're contributing to sustainable lifestyles in a range of really quite complicated and quite intersecting ways that are quite indirect a lot of the time. But the key, they add up. And if you just go to the next slide. With 2050 on this scenario timeline, what that all adds up to is a culture of very distributed power and a real kind of drive towards having an equitable society. Everyone is expected to quite actively play their part. So this taking matters into your own hands and making do and solving problems actually becomes just a normal part of being in this world, and becomes the kind of cultural signature for the overall response to sustainability in that future. So if users and citizens are doing everything, they're contributing to lifestyles change in all different ways, what then is useful that we take away from that as people that are interested in creating change? So here are some of the key elements we've taken from that. So it's not only the kind of practical technological infrastructure-related innovations that are interesting, that users generate. As we've just touched on, it's the sum of the cultural changes that they add up to that actually becomes really interesting. So you see whole new philosophies and norms and beliefs emerging from the subcultures of user and citizen innovation that take place along the pathways. And when you're looking at intervening in the system and you're looking at creating big change, it's often these less tangible, mortal aspects of the system that are the higher leverage points for bringing about a change. So what means is the type of innovations that users and citizens are involved in are some of the higher impact ones if you're looking at a big societal shift over time. So that's really interesting then for us. So is the fact that they're able to operate motivated purely by profit or by sort of typical incentives that are operating in markets. They're able to operate according to a slightly different set of values and goals, to move across what might be the typical boundaries. They're able to be disruptive, and they're able to bring about more sort of radical innovations that tackle the cause of issues. Perhaps the system, the sort of incumbent organisations in a system would struggle to do that because they have to operate within constraints. And thus, what scenarios do is provide a way for us to some of our assumptions about the extent that's really needed for sustainability, and that allow us to develop, therefore, strategies and to design programs that are more robust and that can consider the contribution that users can play, not just directly in bringing about a specific change, but how they can contribute to a whole knock-on effect of changes to contribute to a broader societal transition. In that way, they're similar to any set of future scenarios. It's always useful to fast forward into the future and test some of the things that you wouldn't normally as received wisdoms. But because they tease out the shifts that are required for radical sustainability, they do get us to step outside of our comfort zone, and there's a real value in that. It helps us to explore the complex nature of change and to really question the extent to which we're being systemic in how we go about realising our goals now. And in looking at the whole of society, they also help us to contextualise some of the specific things that we might be interested in around an area of environmental or social impact, but to see that within the whole and to see what needs to be true in order for our goals to be realised. And the next slide. User point of view, it helps us to question, in looking at the trajectory for innovation and all the different ways that users can contribute to change, to question how we might be able to unlock that potential sooner rather than later, and to question some of the ways in which we consider innovation now. Are we inadvertently focusing on the technological, whether that be other sort of social and systems-oriented opportunities for innovation that we could collaborate with users around, and also to question, this isn't inherently a good thing. It isn't an inherent and a bad thing either. It's a series of trends and circumstances that are coming together that represent an opportunity for change. And if we find ways of leveraging that for stability, then the research we've done so far and the scenarios that we've developed indicate that we could create a high order of magnitude effect in doing that. And slide. If you just jump on and to the next one, Marco, conscious of time.
And then just worth saying that we'd really love to share the scenarios with each of you. We have them in written form, but we also want to offer a taster session where you can spend an afternoon with us actually exploring some of these scenarios in more detail and actually understanding what these mean for you and your organisation. So if you're interested in that, then please do let us know. This will be a hands-on session where you can get familiar with the scenarios. Great.
And back to you.
Thank you so much for attempting to consolidate the next 34 years into about 35 minutes. So I think an incredible job on that front. Just one very quick point of clarification from the previous slide. That's 25th of October, 25th in the afternoon.
No, November.
November.
Yeah.
Okay, so plenty of time for people to try and rearrange their diaries. Anybody who is interested in learning more, please just send us a quick email to Marco or to myself at Avis, and we'll be very pleased to put you in direct touch with Louise and Gemma so you can get more information about the event that's taking place on the 25th of November. It's also after our final conference. But anyway, and for one presentation, thank you very much for those insights. We have about 20 minutes left, 15, 20 minutes. So now I'd just like to open the floor and therefore the microphones for those who are with us for any questions or comments or points of clarification that anybody has. As I said, your microphones are open, so please feel free to just speak up. Your question. Anyone who'd like to go first? Okay. In that case, I will try going. And I think certainly one of the most fascinating aspects that we've been exploring in these scenarios, and also the work being done elsewhere in the EU-InnovatE project, is around some of these, the obstacles and barriers that could realistically hinder a series of very good ideas and perhaps emerging trends, that at least on paper support a lot more sustainability within our current systems. Obviously, going back to the 4 scenarios that you looked at and have been augmenting in Work Package 2, could you say something about what you've seen as some of the potential barriers, not just the opportunities and sort of positive trajectories, but something that would really define how we may or may not get to the overall objectives and goals of the 2050 scenarios?
So what I would say is, when you take a look at the scenario pathways and you're looking at the knock-on effects of different innovations and the influences of different actors on those timelines, all interacting with one another to produce changes, what often happens is more radical ideas that emerge through communities and citizens in the way that we've been talking about get to a point where they create a bit of a buzz, and to some extent this is happening or has happened around the sharing economy in different parts of the world. And then a subculture develops around that, and then that subculture will get kind of appropriated by large companies that are working to a slightly different set of interests. So the sharing economy was, when you look at it, most extreme is actually almost trying to create a separate complementary economy that's less oriented around finance and represents alternative ways of consuming and sharing and so on. But some of the ethos of that culture and the language of that culture and buzz that's generated around that can be appropriated by companies. And so there's a sort of a pattern that emerges of innovations kind of getting absorbed into the system rather than really representing an alternative to the system. So I think one of the barriers we have is how we can find ways of and protecting some of these emerging ideas that might be quite counter-cultural and potentially quite challenging to current policy around sustainability, such that they aren't absorbed, and such that when there are then pressures in the system, so when resource scarcity starts to really bite, at other points in the timeline, these alternatives are ready and can then offer a slightly different way of doing things rather than a continuation of business as usual, if that makes sense. So that's one of the key barriers, rising one for us as we looked at the timeline. And more broadly than that, the real strength of user sort of / citizen innovation is that the people involved are the world, of course. They're looking at how they can sustain themselves and their mortgage if they have a mortgage, and cover costs and so on. But they're quite often working to a deeper set of values and motivations that are often a bit longer term than you might have in a traditional business or entrepreneurial mindset, and that are for sort of societal, slightly more sort of benevolent set values, if you like, trying to do good for the world. And very often, policy oriented towards sustainability is still operating within a commercial framework. And so when we analyse the times looking for applications for policy, we find that traditional instruments kind of miss this group, or perhaps they only encompass those elements of the group that are conforming more to commercial priorities right now, missing off the kind of longer term, hard to define set of people that are doing stuff that just doesn't quite fit within our current language and current frames of thinking about things. A metaphor came up quite a few times in our workshops of how there have been in the past programs to nurture emerging technologies, the European Space Programme being one, where technologies are being developed, not quite sure yet where they're going to go, not quite sure yet, because they are so nascent, what economic and sort of relations or political implications might be, but nonetheless they're operating in a protected space, and the need to create not precisely that, but something that can perform a similar function as that for people that are really at the edge of our culture and really sort of challenging us on these progressive innovations.
Thank you. That was incredibly concise and much appreciated. Okay, so who would like to add any comments or questions? The microphone is again open, so anybody can please speak up and contribute.
Through the scenarios a bit more, if that would be of interest.
Can you hear me? It's Rocket from the Big Lottery Fund.
Okay.
Yes, you can.
Hi. I would like to hear more about the scenarios afterwards, but I just had a quick question. Often the ideas around innovation seem to be targeted at those who already can, those who already have the skills and resources to be involved in this anyway. So can you see, looking towards 2050, how we can really engage those who maybe are disempowered or disenfranchised or maybe lack the skills and resources to even consider these sort of approaches?
Yeah, really interesting question. And so the scenarios, I think, throw up some really rich material which to consider that question. I'd say that we have a ready-made answer to that question. I can share a little bit of what's out there. I think it's kind of in the vicinity of an answer, which is that big change we need is so complex. We can't predict the innovations that will be needed. They change over time. They're going to be continually dynamic. Because also that users and citizens do all sorts of things over the course of their life, it becomes even more sensible rather to define success by the innovation that is created, or to seek to stimulate particular innovations, to flip it over and actually look more at the innovator and the qualities of the citizens that we're developing, and that will then create direction for innovation over time. We've broken that down in a number of different ways, and we've explored this from different angles in the workshops that we've run. A really significant element is values that we cultivate, looking at empathy and some of the sort of deeper goals that we cultivate in individuals through the education system, something that really strongly through a lot of the themes of EU-InnovatE. And so the need to cultivate atypical skills. So that's the point I mentioned earlier on about the need to find alternative ways of protecting these new forms of innovation. The skills and the ways of thinking and working that you need in order to do those things are also slightly outside of the commercial norm. So over the course of EU-InnovatE, that skills in creativity, in relating to others, being curious about the world, being reflective. So if you're dealing with complexity and uncertainty, being a good self-oriented learner, being able to sort of stack and test your own assumptions and to correct your own path becomes even more important. The ability to think in terms of systems, to sort of recognise that things are interconnected, as a way of navigating your life, but also as a way of thinking about how you can create success and how you can create change, also become really important. So I think there are two things here. I think one is, or three things rather. I think education and the education system, and the fact that that is currently geared towards our economy and not necessarily towards cultivating individuals that can sort of self-reflect and sort of be more systemic players, is something that's come out as a focus. The need to look not just at skills and abilities but at values came really strongly. And looking at cultivating in that skills space a slightly more systemic set of abilities, which will equip a person to succeed different ways throughout their life, rather than necessarily equipping them for, equipping them in design, say, so that they can do industrial design. There needs to be a slightly more general set of skills than that would remain relevant over the course of a lifetime. I hope that's a little bit, but it's great to talk to you about that in more detail. Afterwards, we share some of the materials that we have and some of the questions that they throw up.
That's great. Thanks so much.
We have had a request for that, because I think talks with our and whatever is actually doing all these specific PDF stuff. That's really on the other hand, if that's what customers are looking for, pioneer partners are
Can you hear me okay?
Let me see again. So,
great, you're back.
yes, I am. Well, and the mute off, that should probably help in terms of communication. So I was simply saying, I think this is sort of a useful bridge into sort of closing remarks, given that we're coming up hard and fast on the 4 o'clock closing point. I think Rosie's comment was a really interesting one, because of course it's very difficult to get a sense of the depth and the richness of the work that's been done, not just around the scenarios, but also in other parts of the EU-InnovatE project. And my last comment before realizing that I'd muted myself was an analogy of a champagne bottle that now only 6 weeks away from the full close of the project. It feels as though that cork is about to be popped. As various partners and blocks of work now start to bring together their final goals, the synthesis of the overall project, and to make sense of 3 years of pretty complicated and nice work. So we're actually going to be bringing this together at a conference in Brussels on Tuesday, November the 22nd, which has no conference fees attached to it. I should also say there are a number of travel subsidies available for people who might be interested in joining us to explore not just the insights coming out of the scenarios work, but some of the other recommendations and insights that we hope resonate with a wider audience about how we can start to accelerate this phenomenon of sustainable entrepreneurship and citizen innovation towards some of these longer-term scenarios and design outcomes at the European level. So the program is now online. If any questions or you're interested, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us here. And if we we just go on to the final slide, we have pretty much, I think about 70% of our resources now up on the EU website. I should note there's a slight typo in the address at the bottom because we've redone the website, so it should read EU-InnovatE.com. But you can get all the information about the resources coming out of the project and the final conference. We would be delighted if people could come on November the 22nd to hear more about what we have achieved, more importantly, what we think it offers in terms of insights and learnings for us to build a new movement of themes of sustainable entrepreneurship and user innovation. So I would like to thank, above all, Gemma and Louise for the hard work in putting together all these headlines into a very short period of time, but it was a full job, and we're very grateful for that. Recording and also the slides will be posted on the website in the not-too-distant future. We can also access the slides and the commentary from the previous 5 webinars from other aspects of EU-InnovatE, including policy innovation, the history of sustainable lifestyles, large companies integrating users in innovation systems, and more. So thank you to everybody for taking the time to join us. We hope this has been an enlightening and enjoyable way to spend an hour. We were very pleasant remainder of the afternoon, and one our thanks to Louise and Gemma for providing us with a very insightful and challenging set of perspectives. So thank you again, and goodbye for now.